Today we are joined by Dr. Kate, the wonderful Dr. Kate. She's a researcher at the University of Queensland. And Dr. Kate has been a big part of some really important research for women with ADHD, particularly women later in life, 30 and beyond. Something that Jaz and I can very heavily relate to.
Yes, as two women diagnosed with ADHD in their late 30s, or mid-30s, we should
Thank
say.
you very
Early
much.
to mid-30s. So we thought today it's definitely a topic that we have wanted to bring forward and discuss for a while, and it's definitely something that our listeners have been asking for. So, yeah, we wanted to bring in the expert, I guess.
We wanted to bring in the expert because there's so much stigma around it, particularly for women our age. And we feel very passionate about that, breaking that stigma down, because once we get this conversation started, I think that's all going to make sense. But I would say if you're one of those people who think about ADHD and you think about a 15-year-old boy jumping around going crazy and can't sit still, this episode's probably for you, because I think we're about to debunk a lot of those thoughts. So Dr. Kate, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I think our first question is the big question we're all asking: why? Why are so many women in their 30s and 40s getting diagnosed now?
Yeah, good question. And it's not just one reason, but there are lots of reasons. I think part of it is that we are starting to understand much better that ADHD shows up in very many different ways for different people. And it's not just the squirmy little boy in the classroom who's calling out and, can't sit still. But I think what's happening with women, particularly in those 30s and 40s, is there is a question around capacity. So they have, it's a busy time of life. There's a lot of demands. They're juggling work and businesses and families and partners and, all of those things. And the way that they used to cope doesn't necessarily work as well anymore. And some of that can be related to hormones, which we can talk about. But I think there is just a sense of, reaching a point where this feels like this isn't working and I need to understand why. So those questions start to be asked of doctors and psychologists and health practitioners around, help me understand why the things that I used to do were possible and now it feels really, really hard to manage.
Yeah. And with that stigma that I think we're finding, do you think that's something that is more recent because so many women are, it feels like all of a sudden getting diagnosed?
Yeah, I think and it's such an unfortunate kind of narrative around this jumping on the bandwagon. Oh, everyone's a bit ADHD. Oh, just another one.
Yeah.
Honestly, when I hear that, it makes my skin crawl. It's really
Makes
upsetting.
me rage.
Same.
And I saw something the other day, which I thought was a really nice analogy. And it's this idea of, there was suddenly a lot more left-handed people when they stopped punishing you for being left-handed. It's not that they weren't left-handed, it's just that they weren't openly able to be left-handed. So I think it's not that there are more people with ADHD, it's just that we understand it better, we're better at recognising it. And I think what's happening with these, sort of diagnostic rates going up for women, we're playing catch up. We're not actually over-diagnosing. I think we're actually recognising that, these women who've struggled for a really long time, they've felt like there's something just a little bit wrong or a little bit off, or they're just not quite measuring up. And this is an explanation that can be really helpful.
Yeah. And what about with, I guess, that feeling of like being believed? There's that first step of actually choosing to do something about it and putting all the noise aside and not thinking, oh, everyone's got it, I can't have it, or my best friend has it, I can't have it. So you get past that step and you're like, okay, I'm going to go and do something about it. But then you turn up to your doctor and you start talking about it and they say, no, it's anxiety. No, maybe it's postpartum depression.
Yeah.
How are you finding that's, I guess, I was one of those people essentially who was diagnosed with one thing and it turned out I actually had something different.
Yeah. And unfortunately, that is a really common experience. So in the study that we did last year, over 70% of the women who were in the study, and they were in the study because they had been diagnosed with ADHD, over 70% of them had been diagnosed with something else first, and it was usually anxiety. It was sometimes depression, sometimes both. There were other examples of bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder. Like there's a whole range of other things that are kind of looked at first. So it's very
Mhm.
rare for ADHD to be kind of the first thing that's looked for in girls and in women.
Mhm.
And the stories that some of these participants shared with me were, they're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 years of asking for help, seeking support, asking questions, engaging with the mental health professionals, following the recommendations, but feeling like there's something really, really wrong with them because they were diagnosed, let's say, with anxiety. They did the medication for anxiety. They might have done CBT for anxiety. And these are the sort of gold standard treatment approaches for anxiety, and they didn't work.
Mhm.
And so then they decided, well, there's something really wrong with me because even the treatments that are supposed to help, they can't help me. So I'm broken.
Yeah.
So it's really hard when that kind of sort of resistance comes from the medical professionals.
Yeah.
And I also hear a lot of things like, you couldn't possibly have ADHD, you're too educated, you're too organized, you're too successful, you're running too many things to be ADHD. And I think that's, a big part of the myth that I hope that we can start to
Mm.
bust, that actually having ADHD facilitates a lot of success.
Yes.
And a lot of very,
yes.
very successful people are working with an ADHD brain. So that's certainly not a way of saying you couldn't possibly have it because of these
Mhm.
things.
And would you say that's where masking comes in? So that's like, maybe let's talk about that a little bit of,
Sure.
is that what people are doing? Is that
Or
why
particularly
it's
women, I think.
is that
Yeah.
why it's so hard for women to be believed and to be heard and to be taken seriously, because they're just being looked at on that superficial level?
Yeah, I mean, I think masking is a really interesting phenomenon. It's very much a part of the ADHD and the autism experience for many people, not just women, but I think particularly for women. And in our paper, we talked about it as, we called it a protective paradox, in the sense that it is protective because it kind of safeguards against that sort of in the moment judgment,
Mm.
the negative consequences at the time. But the trade-off is that it leads to exhaustion and burnout and this sort of sense of not really knowing, well, who am I really? Because I spent a lot of
Yes.
time putting myself out in
This
the
is just
world.
so crazy for me
Anita's
listening to
like,
all this, because I
Yeah.
feel like I'm on the other. I can reflect and look at all
Sure.
this and be like, all of these things have happened to me. But then you're literally like, you're writing my autobiography as you talk. It's so crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And I think the masking can be seen somewhat as socialized. Little girls are taught to behave in certain ways, which are, quite at odds with that sort of stereotype of ADHD. So, they're quiet and they're obedient and all of those kinds of things. But then you sort of, as I said, there's that trade-off where there is a cost, and it's often a cost to physical and mental health and
Yeah.
well-being. And that sense of self is just that real sense of, well, who am I when I'm not trying to be what I think everyone needs me to
Mhm.
be? So it's a bit of a, as I said, it's a protective paradox. It helps, but it also has a cost.
Comes at the cost. And yeah, oh my God, I've just got like so much running through my head now, to be honest.
Like, this is my
I'm like,
life.
yeah, I'm like, I can't
I
even.
think like a little bit more on why is it that people are so why is it that all the successful people seem to be
Sure.
the ones, and I'm absolutely not saying that you have to be successful for, to correlate, but it, what is it about the ADHD that makes that is making these people so successful? Do you know what I mean?
I do, yeah.
People are saying like, you couldn't possibly have it, you're too organized, you're too successful.
Yeah.
Why? Like,
Yeah,
what's
well, I think part of the ADHD story that's not well understood is it's not all about deficits. So the name is very deficit focused, but there are some really clearly identifiable strengths that come with an ADHD brain. And obviously everyone's different, but there are really common experiences of things like big picture thinking. There is the problem solving and seeing patterns that other people don't see. And the participants that I interviewed would talk about being in a work situation where they've sort of gone, oh, I can see that if this and this and this happens, we're going to end up here. And other people in the room are saying, we're not there yet. But then sure enough, so that sort of capacity to see the bigger picture, the creative thinking, high levels of empathy, really intuitive. So just being able to kind of know things without knowing how they know it. So a lot of these things can be really helpful in terms of being innovative and creative and entrepreneurial and a little bit impulsive. So maybe taking some risks that
not so risk adverse is definitely something that we talk and joke about.
Impulsive is literally my personality.
And so that can actually, in certain fields and in certain businesses and things like that, being willing to go, you know what, let's give it a crack and see what happens can be really helpful. So there's a lot about the ADHD brain that is really conducive to success. And the other thing is, in terms of interests, so that capacity to focus when you're interested. So a lot of the participants in our study had done PhDs because they found something that they were passionate about and they can focus on it, to the extent that it's like a hyper focus. So, they're able to do that, managing multiple things at once, having multiple projects on the go feels energizing and interesting as opposed to overwhelming.
That's actually something that Jaz and I joke about, how, give us like an everyday scenario where there's a bit of chaos and we're like, whoa, that's too hard for us.
Like, won't do my tax.
Throw us a crisis that needs to be dealt with immediately. And I'm like, I'm on, don't worry, we've got this. Let's fix it right now, no problem.
So the ADHD brain thrives in situations that are like objectively stressful and challenging. One of my participants told this great story about how she would get super overwhelmed with getting the kids out the door. Like the normal kind of things felt really hard. And yet she actually disarmed a gunman.
Oh my God.
It was just this crazy story, but she's like, I was completely calm. My brain just locked in. I knew exactly what to do, how to do it, like just super calm. And yet getting the kids out the door with enough shoes on enough feet felt really overwhelming. So it was just a really great example of that kind of paradox.
Yeah, that's wild.
One thing I think that really stood out for me in your study as well was that, going back to that, people doing PhDs, people bachelor's, masters, all those sorts of things, because for me, I was a naughty kid at school. You know what I mean? Like, I was the naughty kid who dropped out of school and couldn't focus, and there's no way I would have achieved something like that or stuck to something like that. So I was quite shocked that at those stats.
Yes. But again, that it does make sense though.
Yeah. And it makes, now that you've explained
found the passion,
then it makes so much sense to me now.
Yeah. And I think it's probably helpful to put it in context too, that a lot of them said it took multiple attempts and they tried different things. So it wasn't necessarily, I left school, I did my bachelor's, then I did my honours.
Yes.
Like it wasn't that kind of linear path.
I think there was someone there 13 years.
13 years,
13 years to do it. Yeah, wow.
Yeah. And so it's stopping and starting and it's managing. But I think it is, what I was really pleased about was that it does bust that myth that it's not possible.
Yes.
It is possible with the right conditions and the right support.
Yeah.
So, question, not sure if you'll be able to give this one a definitive answer, but so say, for example, the mothers at home and they've got the two little kids and they've got a job that they need to go back to at some point, managing the household, husband's working full time, it's chaos, probably not sleeping whole nights either. You're sitting on the lounge at night and the dishes need to be done and you're like, I absolutely cannot bring myself to do. This is me talking about myself a little bit, but absolutely cannot do them. And then I find in the morning sometimes, if I've got to get myself ready, get my son ready for daycare, get my daughter ready for school, although that's an easy process, me having to think about how long and all the individual steps makes me think like, oh gosh, I don't want to do this. This is so much. And I know that could be ADHD for some people, but for some people it can just be you're in the thick of life and today it feels hard. So I think with that stigma and this, stereotypes and everything, it can be sometimes hard for women who are in the throes of it to distinguish, hey, maybe this is something I should investigate, or maybe I'm having a hard time. Is there any advice you'd have, I guess, to sort of really think that through? And, at what point do you look at yourself and say, maybe I should investigate it? Maybe there is something there.
I think when you look back, you have probably been asking questions throughout your life. So there's no kind of definitive the threshold between just managing a busy and full and demanding kind of life. But everyone that I've spoken to that has received a diagnosis has said, yeah, I've always felt like there was something. And,
Bit quirky.
there'll be
Yeah.
clues. They're different for everyone. But it's quite common to say things like, primary school was a breeze and then high school got tricky. So there's that
Totally.
kind of
Exactly. Yeah.
sense of being in, the advanced classes or the extension classes. And the time frame's not exactly the same. Some people still found early years of high school quite easy, but then their senior years, it just felt like everything felt
apart.
really hard. So
Yeah.
if there's this kind of noted discrepancy between what appeared to be natural ability and then how that translates to results, that could be a clue.
Yeah.
There are other things that you can look for, like in terms of times of transition being really hard. So, and that kind of cognitive load, like that extra burden of having to manage different and more things. So having little kids and suddenly going, I'm not only responsible for myself, but I'm also responsible for all of these others, which can be a natural transition to motherhood. But as I said, it wouldn't be the first time that experience has been had.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think that for women exclusively is the recognition of the role of hormones and the fact that, they may be times in their cycle where things feel particularly difficult. And I'm not just talking about sort of PMS, I'm talking about the things that we recognize as ADHD. So executive function, emotion regulation, planning, problem solving, time management, those sorts of things, because they rely on dopamine, which relies on estrogen. And so at times in the cycle and at times in the lifespan, so talking perimenopause, which I know we'll probably get to, at times when the estrogen is low, those sort of experiences will be much, much more obvious.
Exacerbated.
Yeah.
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 And that makes sense, doesn't it? Because, some weeks you're just absolutely killing it.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
then the next week you literally couldn't pick up a glass out of the cupboard and get yourself
Yeah.
a glass of water. Just too much.
Yeah. And I think as well, something I've thought about, and you touched on it before, is like reflecting on my 20s. Had a great time.
Sure.
But for a big part of that, I definitely had self-esteem issues that I think I knew I had, that I was just trying to work through myself. And I did often feel like I was meant to be this person, this bubbly person, this life of the party, which I wanted to be, and I knew I could be that, but I struggled to be that person. So I often felt like you have to put a show on. You have to, which might involve drinking more or, whatever it is. And the thing I think I've come back to realize now is just how important it is just to accept that I am who I am, and finding out that I have it has allowed me to do that. Yes, I'm quirky, but I like that.
Sure.
I don't care if you don't like that.
Yeah.
It's just that, it's just that, I'm a bit different and I'm cool with that. And I think when I reflect on my 20s, that's such a big part of it. And you touched on that earlier. And then I guess moving on from that a little bit, I would love to talk about the PMDD and probably eventually get into
probably more touch on the hormone side of things, because I think, is there that link between, like, obviously you were saying when people, they become a mother, different times of the cycle, all those sorts of things. Like obviously when they become a mum, there's the extra load, obviously, but there is also the massive hormonal changes in the body. So is that link as well?
Absolutely.
How do the hormones play a part there?
Absolutely. And I think it's a really good explanation as to why it can feel so difficult for women at those times. Like there's a lot going on in terms of the emotional elements, but there's also like a really clear biological thing that's happening. Like it's a really big deal to have a baby, and there's a lot of hormone changes and adjustments and fluctuations that happen around that time. A lot of women who have a diagnosis of ADHD look back and go, puberty was really tough. And, there was really extreme symptoms of, the mood swings and the emotion dysregulation. And, one of my participants, I think I mentioned it in the paper, who has also got PMDD, and she said it was very predictable for her every month to become actively suicidal.
Yeah, I
So
read.
it was
I
such
read
an
that one.
intense experience for her
Yes.
that, and she's like, literally 2 days later, she would be fine.
You wake up and you're fine.
Yes. And
Yeah.
so I
Yes.
think it's really important that we understand like the influence and the power of these experiences, that this is not just someone having a bad day. Like these hormones are really influential in not just our mood, but in our cognitive functioning. So our ability to make good decisions, to plan, to focus, to be motivated. There's really clear hormonal influences that are sort of
Yeah.
dictating that. And that's why, women have these kind of really significant periods of extra obvious symptoms, which is not the case for males, because obviously they still have the estrogen dopamine interaction, but it's stable. It's much less fluctuating.
Yeah.
Can we just cover off as well on exactly what PMDD is?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it is what would be considered a very extreme experience of, so it's premenstrual dysphoria disorder. So it's like, if we think about sort of PMS, it's that to the extreme. So as I said, suicidal thoughts, really overwhelming depressive experiences in the lead up to a period, and it can be distinguished. It's basically a matter of severity of symptoms,
Yeah.
but very closely linked to the menstrual cycle, and just that really extreme, I shouldn't say just, but an extreme experience associated with.
And it can be depressive, it can be anger, rage,
Yes,
just like extreme
absolutely.
feelings, negative feelings.
Yes, so an intense feeling just of wrongness. So it could come out as anger or rage, or depression, suicidal ideation, that kind of thing. Yeah.
And how long do you find, like, is there a length of time that's typically lasting? Is it just a couple of days you wake up, you feel better?
Typically.
Or does it vary?
Yeah, so it's based on, the hormonal kind of fluctuations across the cycle. So it is usually for a couple of days up to a week in the cycle.
Yeah.
And I think that's another way of kind of being able to distinguish it from other things, is that there's a pretty distinct start and finish time across that cycle.
Yeah. And what about, I guess, with fertility? How does ADHD come into play with fertility as such?
I can't say for sure.
Yeah.
All I can say is that what we're seeing in the literature now is that there's a better understanding that ADHD is commonly occurring with other hormonally influenced experiences such as endometriosis. It used to be PCOS, now it's called PMOS, but that syndrome as well. So I'm not sort of in a position to speculate about
No.
cause and effect, but I think it is becoming clearer that there are tendencies for these things to occur together. So whether there's some kind of relationship, it's
correlation,
a pretty hot topic actually. So there's a lot of research happening, particularly looking at women's health across the lifespan and how ADHD sort of interacts with that, how it how it shows up across the lifespan.
One of the things I found in your study as well, which is not something that I had experienced, so I was quite intrigued by that part too, was the self-esteem. How, like, let's unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
How does that go sort of hand in hand with those like self-esteem issues in ADHD?
Well, what we found was that it was really common for the women who were diagnosed later to have reflected on just feeling like there was so much negative feedback that they were getting. So whether it's, even just things that might sound really innocent, but just why can't you just be more organized, or why can't you just remember what I told you? So there's this constant kind of negative questioning and that sense of, the dissonance between, I think that I'm quite clever, but my grades don't reflect that. So there's this kind of gap between what they perceive to be possible and what they're actually achieving. So there's just this sense of negative feedback, doubt. And what we found was that those kinds of questions, which, can be asked really innocently, become internalized. And so there's this really negative voice in the head saying, well, why can't you just fill in the gaps, whatever the rest of that question is? And so there's this sense of sort of shame. And sometimes, the help seeking that we talked about before, where perhaps the diagnosis is anxiety and then you do the things for anxiety and you still feel that way. So then it's becoming, I'm the problem. There's something very wrong with me.
Yeah.
So there is just this, again, multiple factors at play, but it's often, years, decades even, of just feeling like I'm not quite right. I'm not quite who I should be. Things that look easy for other people feel hard for me. So there's a lot of comparison happening, that, sort of, and we sort of start to assume that if there's something that's different, it's a deficiency.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like an important question, that people might be thinking of is, and something I've heard as well, is why get the late diagnosis? Like what is the point? Let's say you might not want medication. You did talk about before that medication might not be the best option. Why would anyone get a diagnosis if they weren't going to go down that line of getting the help, I guess, afterwards?
Yeah, and it is a really good question. And so I think some of the things that I've seen that are on the other side of that diagnosis are, there's access to medication if you'd like it, and those sort of formal, therapeutic supports, that's great. But it may also be helpful in certain workplaces or jobs, or if you're studying, if you do need additional supports or some adjustments that can really help you to thrive in your work and in your study environment. But some of the other ones which can be really helpful, and we probably don't talk about as much, is around being able to communicate what it is that you need and how your brain works, with your loved ones, with your family, with your friends. So I think having that kind of framework for having those conversations around why it might be that you do need to do things in a certain way, or you don't do certain things, or certain things are hard for you. But probably the most important thing that I've seen is the self-knowledge and the understanding that comes from that, which gives you access to self-compassion, and this idea of giving yourself permission to ask for what you need. So knowing that if you have an ADHD brain, your social battery might be really, really great, and then by the end of the day you are absolutely done, and giving yourself permission to decompress and sit on the couch if that's what you need to do, without that kind of voice in your head saying, why can't you just, the guilt and the shame and all of that sort of stuff. So I think there are some, really good reasons to get that diagnosis, because it can just sort of facilitate those conversations, but also the self-compassion and the kindness, which I think is probably worth recognizing, that those things can be available without a formal diagnosis. So it's expensive, it's time consuming, it can be challenging. The process itself is quite complicated. So if you don't want to go down that path, then the things that won't be available would be medication and those formal sort of adjustments. But those other things, in terms of having conversations and giving yourself some kindness and compassion, are still possible.
Yeah. And I think, Jaz, something that we were talking about off mic as well is I think there's two parts of it, but you talking about you and Mikey and your dynamic and how it's helped you.
Yeah, definitely. Like in my relationship, I think early on in the relationship, Mikey and I are very, very different people, and he's very, very clean and very organized, very routine, just does everything, that he's supposed to do. And I'm the opposite. Like if he's going to ask me to get the washing off the line, I'm not going to remember to get the washing off the line, or, I'm not going to do the dishes at night. I just don't do it. Like it's really hard for me to get up and do that. so many people, and probably even listening to this right now, would be thinking, that's so lazy. Like, that's such a cop out. You know what I mean? Like, oh, she won't do the dishes overnight or
But
whatever.
that's something that we do as women as well. We
Yeah.
start saying to ourselves, why are we so lazy? Because we don't understand why we can't get it together.
Yeah.
But I think, again, for you, Jaz, Mikey has gone out and done so much homework himself
Yeah.
to understand you.
He will come home and, be like, oh, do you know why you make little piles around the house? And do you know why you do this? And he's gone and researched that stuff so that he understands how to work better with me. And we don't argue now because of that. I think back to, like, if we ever had arguments, it would be because we just weren't understanding each other and how we work. And he's sort of going, well, I can get all this done. And, I can, if I'm cooking a meal, he can clean up. Like, he's cooking, he's cleaning as he goes. And he's there looking at me going, why can't you do that?
Yeah.
And now he just laughs and goes, oh, you would never be able to do that. Like, and it's funny to him now. Like, he sort of just laughs and he knows, like, oh, I could help her clean up during it, or I can, like, he just knows how to work with that now.
Yeah.
And it's such a nice, like, comforting place to be, and not to feel like, oh, like, I used to look at the kitchen and think, oh my God, it's such a mess, but I want to sit down and relax and eat dinner. But I know Mikey's going to be looking at it thinking, and it's so, or even like, that's just popped into my head then, saying you're going to do something and you don't. Like, that's such a, like, people think that's such a bad trait, and you feel guilty for it. I do that all the time.
But then also, it's that it doesn't always look like that, because for me, I can be the opposite to you, and I can be a bit obsessive.
Yes.
So, for example, if I asked Kerrod, my husband, to do something, I want him to do it right this second.
Yeah.
And that used to frustrate him, because he's like, it doesn't need to be done this second, but I'm going to do it. Whereas now it might be something small, and he can say to himself, if I just do it now, I'm helping her.
Yes.
And it's easier. Whereas I can also say to myself sometimes, it's okay if he doesn't do it straight away.
Yes.
That doesn't need to be such a big deal for you. So I think such a big benefit of finding out is that it allows you and your loved ones around you, it might not always be your partner, but it allows those loved ones around you to also understand you better, and it can just improve the way that you're communicating with each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we talk about ADHD as an explanation, not an excuse.
Yes.
And I think that, because there is that kind of stigma around, oh, it's just an excuse for being lazy or for copping out and, not doing the dishes. But when you actually understand the way that the ADHD brain works, it makes sense that those sorts of things can be really tricky. And as you say, there's this sense of being able to work with it and create routines or create dynamics that sort of are supportive of that. And there's no shaming or blaming or, self flagellating.
Yeah.
It's just, when I cook dinner, this is what it looks like. And when he cooks dinner, it looks different. And that's fine.
Yeah.
And I think too, something we were talking about offline before was the hormonal side of things. That makes so much sense as well, because the other thing that even I didn't understand until coming across your papers as well was the shifts in the hormones. So, throughout our cycle, sometimes Mikey will come home, I've cleaned the whole house from top to bottom and it's spotless, and I've done the dishes, and I've, rearranged the cupboards, and I've done it all. Other days, I can't even put a cup in the sink.
Yeah.
And it's so wildly different from week to week or day to day. So can we unpack a little bit about hormones and how they play that part?
Well, I was just going to say on that as well, and talking about reasons for finding out.
Yes.
The mental load of it all, I think, because with ADHD, you already have such a mental load, but then particularly for women in their 30s, in the thick of it, you already have your mental load as well. If you add that ADHD on top of it, you're doubling the mental load, and it can be hectic. And I think finding out sometimes, it just allows you to forgive yourself a little, or be more forgiving to yourself, to understand why at nighttime you don't want to wash the dishes and you want to sit on the lounge, and being okay with that at that point, to understand why the morning routine might feel so monotonous, but you can still execute it and get it done.
Yeah.
And I think it just, it allows you just to have a better understanding of the way you work, and just be like a little bit more forgiving. And, something that I think I've had to learn to do post finding out, which has been extremely helpful for me, is understanding the hormones. And there are parts of that cycle where I know I'm going to mop the floors 3 times in 1 week, but in 2 weeks' time I won't mop the floors for 10 days. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm never going to pick up a mop again in my life.
Yeah.
But now I know that moment will pass and it all comes around, and being okay with, for 2 weeks of the month, the house might look different to the other 2 weeks. That's all right. But
It's fine.
it's all just, I think the benefit of finding out, it doesn't mean you've got to go on meds. It doesn't mean you have to make any drastic changes to your life, but it just allows you to have such a better understanding of who you are, for others to understand you as well.
Yeah.
And you're just more at peace, I think.
Yeah,
That's
definitely.
the biggest takeaway for me anyway.
For sure. But yeah, hormones.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the hormonal. You can tell we're going off on the tangents.
Yes.
But
That's okay.
the hormones
It's
and the relation.
complicated, yeah, but I think at its most simple level, if we think about dopamine, it is really helpful in the brain for things like executive functioning, so planning, problem solving, time management. It's also helpful for emotion regulation. It's also helpful for focus and motivation. So all of these things probably sound pretty familiar because those are the things that are, impacted when you have an ADHD brain. So what we sort of recognize now is that estrogen supports dopamine. So when there's less estrogen, there's less dopamine. And so we know that across the menstrual cycle, there will be times when there is less estrogen available, which means less dopamine available, which means those ADHD experiences are more prominent. And then at other stages in the cycle, there's more estrogen available, more dopamine available. So that's when you're probably mopping the floor and doing the dishes. So I think it's helpful, again, just to really kind of put it as an explanation and a bit of a framework around this too shall pass. So there'll be times in the cycle when things feel really hard. But I do think that knowledge really helps to sort of put it into context as well, that I'm not always going to feel like this. It's not always going to be this hard. And so kind of having that sort of framework around recognizing that the fluctuations are relatively predictable.
Yes.
And you can work with, and I think, giving yourself permission to work with your energy, to work with your emotions, to work with your, capacity to focus and be motivated is just, I think you mentioned just feeling at peace, like just, because I think some of that mental load is all the things that you need to remember. And then there's this additional layer of why is this hard for me? So that kind of questioning and the blaming and the shaming, which takes resources, So sort of having the answer to that question, why can't I just do whatever? It's like, because my brain doesn't work like that. Great, I can stop thinking about that now, and it frees up space.
Stop putting that pressure on yourself.
That loop can go. We can close that loop off. We have the answer, and go about sort of structuring it in a way that makes it easier to do the things that you need to do.
Do you think that is a big part of the reason we're seeing so many people being diagnosed with ADHD in their into their 30s, into their 40s, having kids, right? So obviously we spoke before about the mental load and how, you get to a point where you just can't handle everything, and that's why you might go out and seek that diagnosis because you're having those issues. But is it also the hormonal change? Obviously having a baby, there's a lot that goes on in the human body. How does that sort of correlate?
Yeah, so I think, there's a lot of things happening both biologically but also sort of socially and, occupationally. So if you think sort of mid-30s to 40s, you've been in the workforce for a couple of decades by now, so maybe you're in a position of relative seniority. There's pressures associated with that. Managing a busy household, getting kids to where they need to be, maybe even dealing with, parents who might be having some health issues, that kind of sandwich generation experience is starting to come. And that's all happening while your hormones are doing things that they're doing. And so, there's a really strong pattern of women who it's not until they've reached perimenopause that they go, okay, what is going on? And so that is kind of a catalyst for getting a diagnosis because it's just that, the hormone depletion is so acute that they just need answers.
What is something that people with entering that perimenopausal stage with potentially undiagnosed ADHD, what are things that they're probably finding that they're feeling?
Yeah, a lot of them think that they've got early onset dementia. So the
Okay.
cognitive symptoms are really, really exacerbated. So things like losing your words, being unable to form coherent sentences. So I think that's probably one thing that maybe actually does trigger the help seeking, because the cognitive symptoms, in addition to emotion regulation and those other things, but that's probably the thing that's the most different from previous times. And as I said, if you're working and you're in a position of, you don't want to be hosting a meeting, chairing a meeting, and you lose your words.
Yes.
So there's that real sense of this is urgent, like this is important, and I can't just kind of, get through just by trying harder. Those
Yeah.
kinds of things they're significant, and they do sort of catalyze that. I need answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there would be so many people listening to this as well that perhaps have been diagnosed with, say, postpartum depression, anxiety, and those sorts of things. And they've taken the medications, they've done the things, they've done the therapy, it hasn't worked. They're probably not even realizing that correlation, right, between the ADHD and, some people may have been misdiagnosed, is what I was sort of taking from your research. Some people may have both.
Yeah.
But yeah, can we talk about that a little bit about?
Yeah. And I think one of the challenges is that having ADHD is exhausting. So it's having a brain that doesn't switch off. It's having to, even sort of the coping can be quite labor intensive. So it's setting multiple alarms, it's having multiple planners, it's having multiple, so it's just objectively a lot. And so when you're sort of managing that in combination with postpartum depression, or that transition to parenthood, there's just this sense that there's so much going on that if we're thinking about resources, in terms of emotions and energy and attention, there's already a heavy demand just by kind of operating with an ADHD brain. One of the participants gave a really nice analogy, and she said, it feels like, let's imagine you need to cross the road. And she said, the way I see it, a neurotypical brain, you look left, you look right, you look left again, and you cross the road. An ADHD brain needs to climb a mountain to cross the same road.
Do you know
there's
why I'm
just
giggling?
The
obstacles.
crossing story.
Yeah. Sorry.
That's okay. So that was really helpful for me to understand. It's like, you're getting to the same place. So you're still getting the kids to school, but the kind of hurdles that have needed to be
The
overcome
conversations that you're having with yourself.
to get there is just a lot. And so, one of the things when I asked participants, what does ADHD feel like? Almost everyone said exhausting.
Mhm.
So there's just this sense that it's just a lot. And so when you're doing that in the context of other exhausting things, like managing a newborn who wakes up every 2 or 3 hours or whatever they do, there's just a real energy drain as well.
I think like using the crossing story is actually a really good one because
Yeah.
and we were talking earlier offline as well about how ADHD presents so differently in so many different people. And just because you don't tick every box or because you're not the same as the person next to you with it, Anita and I couldn't be more different. I feel like we're so different. And we actually told a story on a previous episode about Anita, one of those things that just you get embarrassed about. Like it's just something, carrying
You're
toilet
trying to
paper
cross
out of the
the road,
supermarket or
yeah.
whatever it might be. Anita was just at a crossing and she was like, oh, I've got to cross the road. Oh, there's a car there.
Do I wait? Do I go? Do I wave? Do I look down? I've got a bag. What if the bag breaks? Like just whereas
everything
everyone else
that
is
went
like,
through
there's a
her
crossing.
brain.
That's
I
my
would just
right away.
cross. And you know what? I probably haven't even looked to see if there's a car there.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's a crossing. Off I go sort of thing. And it's just so funny that we can be so different.
But then also as well,
that.
we're so similar. At the same time, like for example, we joke about let's just book the holiday. We'll sort the money out later. Or when we talk about something's really expensive, most people their default is how do I save more money? Ours is well, how do we make more?
How do we
We don't
more
want less.
to buy
We're not
that?
going to save. Absolutely not. We're just going to make some more so we can do all the things.
Yeah.
And I would love, if you don't mind, could you share that funny little story you told us earlier?
I can. I think it was one of my favorite stories. We're talking about when ADHD has worked out well, like when it's been great. And one of the participants was sharing a story with me that it was actually her birthday, and she was driving home from work and she came across an auction and she was like, I'm going to check it out because it's my birthday. And so she bought the house.
Mm.
And so it all worked well. It was an interesting phone call to the husband to say, hey, honey, I bought a house.
Yeah.
But it was just this really fun story where she's like, it was fine. It could have gone badly.
Yeah.
But it didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
That's
why
so
I think as
cool.
well, like with ADHD, a lot of people think of it like it's such a negative thing. And why would I find out I have it? Who cares? I can function perfectly fine just the way I am. But I'm like, you don't have to look at it in such a negative light. It's actually not a negative thing if you can, I guess, harness it and understand it really well. It's definitely been a superpower for me because I love the life I have, and I'm 100% certain I wouldn't have it if I didn't have ADHD. So I think and I guess that's a part of the stigma as well. When people think about it, they put such a negative spin on it, but it can be really positive as well. And such good things can come from it. And you admitting you have it or telling your family you have it doesn't mean that your parents have parented incorrectly, or it doesn't mean that you're broken. It doesn't mean that you've got to fix something. You don't have to do anything at all, but it just allows you to have a better understanding. But I think as well, Jazzy and I are glass half full type of people. So we're like, okay, cool, we've got it. Yep, let's get on with it. But something that you talked about in your research that took us by surprise, we've talked about it together, is the grief. And I guess when we had spoken about it beforehand as well, it resonates with me in that I did have some feelings, but it wasn't in a way where I felt like I was grieving. But could you talk a little bit more about the grief?
Sure. So in the study, we asked the participants to share 3 words that captured their emotional journey since receiving their diagnosis. And as expected, I suppose, a lot of them said things like relief and validation, which I was fully prepared for and no surprises. But it did surprise me that another very common one was grief. And so because it was surprising, I was curious and wanted to know more. And in speaking more about it, it became clear that having the diagnosis, as validating and as empowering as it can be, it can also bring grief both retrospectively, so going back in the past, and also prospectively, which is looking to the future. So the retrospective grief was this sense of, I wish my younger self knew this about herself. A lot of suffering could have been avoided. So those feelings of not being good enough, being too much and not enough and not clever enough, and all of those things we talked about before with the self-esteem could have been avoided, as well as other things that perhaps they've done some self-medicating. They might have engaged with drugs and alcohol and eating, disordered eating. A whole range of suffering could have been avoided. But then the prospective grief was this sense of, well, now that I know I have ADHD, I know I'm always going to have ADHD. And so the things that feel hard for me now will continue to feel hard. So I can't, just try harder. I can't just buy another planner. Maybe a different color will be better. That sense of just another schedule, another set of reminders. So I think there was that sort of recognition that the knowledge of this is me and this is my brain and this is how it works, whilst it can be very validating and, like we talked about before, give you access to asking for what you need and self-compassion and all of those things. But it is kind of understandable that it's like, well, now I know that this is how my brain works and these hard things will continue to be hard.
Yeah, and that could be really, really hard for some people to deal with, like we were saying, we're quite lucky in the sense that we're happy that we've been so impulsive in certain circumstances. We probably shouldn't be so happy we've been so impulsive in some, but, some people may have not had the same experience. Like they might not have, impulsivity might not be the thing that they've had. And, they might have had some really, really hard times, or they might be really relying on the fact that next week they're going to be more organized and, that sort of thing. It could be that they're single and they don't have a partner because they feel like they don't have their life together. And now they're sitting here thinking, I'm never going to have my life together because this is who I am. And there's so much, I think, to consider, I guess, in everyone's feeling different. And also like going back to that stigma around, if like a friend of mine was to come to me and say, oh, I think I have ADHD, or I think I'm going to go and explore a diagnosis. Like, I think there's nothing worse that you can do than just be like, oh no, you don't have it. Like, you don't have it, or like, I think you have it, or, like, that's fine. Like, that's your opinion. but
Yeah.
like only you know what you're really like. Do you know what I mean? And even some of like my friends and family wouldn't know the real way
They
that I
haven't
operate day to
seen all the
day.
symptoms day to day.
You know, unless
Yep.
they've lived in my house, unless they've, you know, sat beside me for an extended period of time. And when we actually did our assessments, Mikey's assessment, that's my husband, obviously someone who spends a lot of time with me day in, day out, versus family or friends that didn't live in the same state as me, two completely different answers on those questionnaires. And the psychiatrist said to me, that is so common because these people here have this perception of you that, you know, we might look at our friend that thinks they have ADHD and go, no, you don't. Like, look at you. You're doing this, you're doing this. You don't do the same things as us, or which is so irrelevant.
And I also think that's where the masking comes into play as well.
Yeah.
Because when I reflect on my high school years, I know my parents had a perception that I was this great child because I could always sit in a really high class.
Yes.
I was always at the bottom of that class. And that was because I was just lucky enough
struggling to stay there.
to be clever enough to get there. But I didn't do anything in there.
Yeah.
I did not do anything at all.
Yeah.
And I hated it. I hated trying to understand the concepts. It was all too much. I just put everything in the too hard basket and I was just a smart ass. But I could mask enough to get by so my parents didn't ask questions or wonder.
Yeah.
But anyway, I feel like we could talk forever. We could sit here and pick your brain forever,
We need like
Dr.
a
Kate.
part 3, 4, 5.
I think the question I would like to close out on is, you know, that comment of like, oh, everyone has ADHD these days can be really harmful, particularly for women. What advice would you give to a woman who thinks maybe something is going on but is hesitant or reserved
Scared
to
or
find out
embarrassed?
more?
Yeah.
And I think it is such an important question because the risk is real.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there does continue, even though having conversations like this is really great and there is much better understanding about the way that ADHD can look different in girls and women. So I think some of that initial kind of not knowing, we are breaking that down, but there still persists some barriers and some, you know, knowledge gaps. So one of the things that I would recommend is to actually look for stories online about what it's like for ADHD in women specifically, because if you just look at the criteria, you know, kind of a bit of historical context, it was developed based on boys. So it sort of captures more accurately that stereotype that we're familiar with. So really engaging with stories that capture what it's like for girls and women is a helpful one. The other thing is to be prepared to maybe have to advocate for yourself. So you may actually go to your GP and they may say, I don't think this is true for you. And as hard as it can be, I think it's important that if you do have that strong belief, to keep asking, whether it's going to someone else. But I think just recognizing, and there are some amazing clinicians that are specializing in working with women with ADHD. So I would recommend sort of looking for those services that actually understand how it does show up differently. But I think, being prepared. I wish I didn't have to say that, but I think it's important to kind of be prepared for
some pushback.
possible pushback. And the thing that I've sort of fallen back on is no one's getting diagnosed with ADHD for fun. You know, like I think this is not tire kicking. This is not, this could be fun for me. You know, like it's expensive, as we've talked about, it's time consuming. So I think it's really important that if someone presents as, you know, this could be true for me, that we do honour their story and be open to what that reality might be.
Yeah. And I think as well, if you're there talking to that professional, sure, maybe you don't have ADHD, but that they have the capacity to say, but maybe there's something else we need to explore. Finding someone who makes you feel comfortable and that you are actually exploring everything, not just writing you off, I think is really important as well.
Absolutely. Because you know, what we're seeing is a lot of women who are getting diagnosed with ADHD are also getting diagnosed with autism, or, you know, and it may be one or the other, it may be both, it may be something else. You know, it may be anxiety, it may be depression, but if you're asking the question, you're asking for help and for understanding. So I think if you do reach out and you do get that kind of shut down, it's important to keep asking. Yeah.
And we will share Dr. Kate's research because it's so worth reading, even if you're someone who doesn't have it, if you're someone who lives with or in a relationship with someone who does, it's so educational for them, but also just for yourself. We're going to share that in the show notes. We'll put it up on Instagram as well. If anyone wanted to track you down, ask you some more questions or find out some more about you, where would be the best place to do that?
I think LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me. Yeah.
Dr.
I'm so sorry. I was like trying so hard.
Okay,
Nick,
hang
did
on.
you notice that for like 5
Yeah,
minutes? I was like,
when you did your drink, yeah. Dr. Kate
Witteveen.
yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming in.
Pleasure.
We're so grateful we found you.
Lovely to
And I'm
chat to
sure
you.
there'll be a lot of other women who are going to feel grateful after this as well. And maybe we'll get you back one day, because I feel like we could talk about this for hours.
I feel like we need, part 5, 6, 7. Yeah, we could
Yeah.
definitely talk for a very, very long time. So
Yes.
thank you.
There's
Thank you
lots
so
happening in
much.
the space. So happy to
Yes,
share.
yes.
Yep.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool.